Hello, Harry here, and welcome back to another episode of Jog On. If you enjoy Jog On, you can really help us out by hitting subscribe, giving us a rating on Apple Podcasts, or even recommending an episode to a friend. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and now it's on to the episode. On today's episode, I had a nutritionist by the name of Jack Coak. Currently studying his master's at Oxford Brookes, Jack already has a wealth of knowledge regarding the benefits of nutrition for athletes, endurance athletes, and of course, runners. I wanted to pick Jack's brain a little bit regarding some of this knowledge and what good nutrition looks like for runners right down from 5K park runners all the way up to ultras. We spoke about what good carb loading looks like.
So everything that you're sort of told to do during life for health, so like have fibrous foods, have vegetables, kind of like goes out the window.
The benefits of using caffeine.
That could have 80 milligrams of caffeine. That could have 300 milligrams of caffeine in it.
Some of the common myths with running nutrition.
It doesn't burn more fat, but it can have an important role in enhancing fat oxidation.
And hopefully some of those questions you've always wanted to know the answer to regarding eating and running. It was fascinating to talk with him and a pleasure to have him on. He's very knowledgeable in his field, and I hope that maybe you can get something from our conversation. We started the conversation by talking about how Jack first began as a chef. So please, welcome to Jog On, Jack Coak.
I'm a registered sport and exercise nutritionist with the Sport and Exercise Nutrition Register. And I guess how I sort of got into nutrition was, so when I was younger, like we're talking like 6, 7, I did a lot of cooking with my mum. And always really wanted to pursue the dream or the goal of becoming a chef. And I followed that right up until I was 18, where I trained to be a chef at college. And to be honest, I didn't really cut the mustard. I just didn't really enjoy that high pressure environment of being in a kitchen. And I sort of was a bit more methodical and enjoyed the science behind what was on the plate and what was going on behind the scenes sort of thing. So then decided to hop on to do a degree in human nutrition up at St. Mary's University in Twickenham. Really enjoyed that. And then branched into sports nutrition, trying to educate athletes on how nutrition can really take them from sort of average to elite and unlock those 5 to 10%, which they didn't really think was possible.
It's really fascinating that you started out as a chef. I briefly did a bit of waiting. So I had to do that thing where you run in and grab 3 plates and balance them and go back out. And I always looked at these guys who were sweating behind like trays of baked potatoes and all this crazy stuff. Like it looks like quite a harsh job. How quickly did you realize this isn't for me when you started chefing?
Pretty quickly, because I was probably used to just cooking at home and creating my own recipes, which is something I'm quite big on now. Like you'll see like other nutritionists or sports nutritionists, they'll niche in different things. But I've got cooking and recipe development as like my core ethos sort of thing. So I'm still quite hands-on with cooking recipes and recipe development and stuff like that. But it was just, it sounds bad, but it was too much hard work, to be honest. And just that I don't really like being told what to do or shouted at. So I like sort of doing things my own way, which is how I have my own business sort of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty harsh environment, the kitchen. I knew a guy, actually weirdly random anecdote, I met a guy in Thailand who had been a chef all his life. He worked in Bath, and when he was on holiday, I think he was having one of those kind of slight epiphanies where he was questioning whether he should still be a chef, and he was telling me a few stories about it. Similar to what you just said, he was just like, everyone's just shouting at each other. He was like constantly under a time pressure to cook something within a certain time, to have it up and plated. And the same thing, it sort of ruined his love of cooking. He sort of had this thing that he wanted to go into because he loved it, and then he went into this high pressure environment, was just like, this isn't for me, and wasn't paid very well for it and worked crazy hours. So
yeah, I agree with you on that. And another thing with it is that you don't really get the sort of fulfillment. So like, I give an example, say I work with a professional boxer and they make weight. For me, that's a massive box ticks, and then they go out and fight and they're fueled and they're rehydrated and refueled properly, and then they win their fight and it's 10 weeks of hard work and I played a role in that.
Yeah.
And then celebrations afterwards. It's much more fulfilling, and knowing that I've helped educate them as well, and I've helped them reach a collective goal and a big step in their career. Whereas opposed to if you're a chef and you make a plate of food, usually it will get sent back, or the customer will make a complaint, or you won't know if it's if you've done a good job or not. It's just, yeah.
That's a slight shame, isn't it? Because there's that famous line of my compliments to the chef, because the person consuming the end product that you created, they never really meet, do they? They're sort of you're hidden out the back. So it would be quite nice sort of see people going, this is amazing, and like waving at you. The only time that would happen is if like when you can see that kind of open like pizzeria place, when you're in a place and you can see the guy like throwing
just wave through.
Yeah, put a thumb up. This is good, thank you. You move from chefing into sports nutrition. You realise that's probably a path path to go down. It's a fascinating thing, nutrition, because people tend to know what to do in terms of a training session, what a Sunday long run looks like. Even sort of they have a vague understanding of even sleep patterns, that they should get a decent amount of sleep and blah, blah, blah. But nutrition is always this weird category where no one ever could give you like a detailed summary. It's a bit of a kind of a wing it job for a lot of runners out there. And, they just sort of eat when I feel hungry. And then if I have a race, I'll sort of have an extra bowl of pasta the night before. But it's never something that we tend to have as much of an understanding or an in-depth an understanding of. And obviously there's going to be a large difference. People listening to this will range right from someone who just does a Saturday park run through to someone who's quite a high level elite person and likes to fine tune themselves and really tweak it. So do you tend to give a slightly different offering to someone, whether they are just looking to do a few jogs a week, right through to someone who's high level?
There's the sort of two things with that. Number one is that, yes, the more elite somebody is, the more important nutrition is. So if you're a professional England runner, the nutrition is going to be much more dialed in and much more bespoke than it would be for perhaps the 5 to 10K runner. And yeah, we would need to then look closer at maybe, like specific grams or get some blood tests done to correct any nutritional deficiencies. Whereas a 5K runner, I mean, nutrition, I'll be honest, nutrition doesn't play a huge role in 5K or 10K. Your basic core cardiorespiratory fitness is what's going to play a key role in running a 5K. The way that nutrition could perhaps affect a 5K is you could impair your performance by obviously eating very close to running a 5K, or you could eat some spicy or fatty or fibrous rich foods in the hours preceding. So really, yeah, nutrition plays a big role in the sort of higher up the ladder you get, the more percentage it can sort of knock off.
So starting off, for people in 5K, 10K, as you say, it's not quite so drastic and important regarding nutrition. For you, does that sort of kick in around sort of half marathon distance upwards? When do you hit that point when you're like, we really need to look at what you're taking on board, even during the race? What distance does that start at?
During the race, so I usually say if you're going out for anything more than an hour, you need to be taking on board some form of carbohydrates and fluid. I think anything under an hour, you don't need to be, I mean, you can, but you don't need to be taking anything on board. An hour of exercise in the grand scheme of things is not a long period of time. And if you're carrying water bottles, some people can find that as quite inconvenient. But I say anything over an hour, you need to be aiming at least 30 grams of carbohydrates. That might be in the form of a sports drink or an energy gel. And then sort of like 5, 10K, just make sure that you have a carbohydrate rich meal. Say you're running a 10K at 11 a.m. You might want to wake up at 7:30, 8 o'clock, have a big bowl of porridge, honey, and some dried fruit to top up that liver glycogen. And then maybe a snack, sort of like a high glycemic index snack, one hour before you go out. So that might be half a banana or like a Rice Krispie Squares bar or a couple of Jaffa cakes. I always find personally that I run better in the morning if it's later on in the day and I've got more food in my system. Whether if it's digested or not, I always find that my go-to thing is usually a bowl of porridge. Like I say quite a lot, that nutrition is heavily individualized. So with like the 5K and 10K, you might want to experiment at different times that you train and then experiment with different meals and what sits best with you. But generally speaking, a nice rich carbohydrate meal a couple of hours before, and you should be able to run that 5K, 10K with no issues whatsoever.
Yeah, that's interesting, thinking about that hour mark. That's definitely something in the past I've noticed, that anything post that sort of hour marker, particularly when I haven't been at sort of peak fitness, I have started to sort of have a bit of a drop off, and you feel a little bit more like you're playing with fire if you haven't quite eaten right around that time. One of the things that people do get a bit baffled by is this concept of carb loading. It's a term that we're all very familiar with, but if you asked 100 different runners what carb loading meant to them, you'd probably get 100 different answers. So
yeah, for sure.
Just for someone who really doesn't understand carb loading from a scientific perspective, what does good carb loading look like? If you've got a long distance race coming up in the sort of the week, the days before, the night before, very roughly, what does good carb loading look like?
The goal is to go and top up your fuel tank. And the way that we do this is through the form of carbohydrates in the form of muscle glycogen. So that's our stored form of carbohydrates. So I like to call it like our stored fuel tank. And it's not as simple as sort of going to the Tesco garage and picking up a fuel tank of diesel or petrol and putting that in the car and filling it up. And we use this sort of carbohydrate loads to basically maximize the fuel stores in that tank. And a mistake that people make across the board is that they they almost see the morning of competition as fueling the tank when it really should just be topping up the tank in the morning of competition. But if we rewind the clock back, so you want to essentially be carbohydrate loading 36 hours before your event start time. So if you're racing on a Saturday, you ideally want to start the carbohydrate load, possibly on the Thursday evening in the evening meal, but 100% on the Friday. And you want to be aiming to consume around 8 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrates. So quick maths, if you're a 90 kg athlete and you're trying to consume 10 grams per kilogram, that would be around 900 grams of carbohydrates. And eating 900 grams of carbohydrates in a day is very, very difficult.
It's a lot, yeah.
It's a lot, but people that will just sort of eat pasta or eat rice, maybe a slice of bread for a snack, they'll only be really hitting 400, 500 grams. So you're thinking of a storage capacity of fuel because of this huge event that you're putting your body through the next day. You're not topping it all the way up. And if you get the fuel tanks topped up all the way, that's a massive benefit for your performance the next day compared to somebody that's only half topped it up with 400 grams a day instead of 900. The best way to do a carbohydrate load is to opt for foods little and often, high in carbohydrates, and you want to try and keep the fiber intake relatively low. So instead of perhaps having fruit, you might want to have tinned fruit. You might want to opt for like jam instead of peanut butter. You might want to opt for like white wraps or white bagels instead of seeded ones, which keep you fuller for longer. So everything that you're sort of told to do during life for health, so like have fibrous foods, have vegetables, kind of like goes out the window for one day, just to make sure that you're getting on board as much carbohydrates which go into the muscle as possible. And then, the morning of the next day, so it's event day. Like I said, this is the mistake a lot of people make, is that they try and fuel 4 hours before their event when they should have already topped the fuel tank all the way up the day before if they've done it right. This should just be to top up liver glycogen stores, which sort of deplete overnight. And that's around 70 to 110 grams. But yeah, that's essentially carbohydrate loading, and there's a lot of misconceptions about it.
In regards to training, Jack, should people be trying to replicate the way they're going to be eating? So something like carb loading, should this be something that they also, if they've got a long Sunday run coming up, that they already start to get their body used to that concept of a little bit of carb loading before and start to replicate training runs that look a little bit more and more like the actual what race day will look like?
Yes, 100%. And it's a really good question. Yeah, if you're sort of targeting a really long run, then you should try carbohydrate loading the day before that run, or at least try and hit towards that number. So just give it a go and try and maybe hit, if you're trying to hit 900 grams, try and hit 700 grams of carbohydrates and see how you get on. But yes, you should always try and use long training runs as sort of like a test run, which you should trial nutrition strategies during as well. And then you'll really find sort of like what I like to call your sweet spot. Find what works for you on the day before. You'll find then what meal works for you the morning of, and then you'll find what works for you in relative conditions on the day as well. So it's almost like you should have a few dress rehearsals. The day before you're about to drive up to Newcastle, you're going to fill your car up with a full tank of petrol. During the day, the next day, you're going to, along the way, you might chuck 10 quid, 15 quid in the form of petrol, which is the same as chucking in 3 to 4 energy gels during a marathon, So when you start thinking of your body as almost like a vehicle, the body's the vehicle, the sort of cogs in the brain start to tick, and people get it when you sort of phrase it that way.
It's quite fascinating, this whole concept of trying to replicate what race day might look like. I've mentioned it to you before when we met, that I personally in the past have realised when I'm standing on a start line at 10 o'clock in the morning for a big city race, that moment doesn't look anything like what I've trained for. And by that, I mean, first of all, like I train afternoon, evenings most of the time. Very rarely would I go for a run at 10 a.m., which is when a lot of these races start, 9, 10, 11 a.m. park run, obviously every Saturday is 9 o'clock in the morning. And I rarely run at that time. So first of all, my body's a bit like, well, we don't usually run at this time. And I'm not only running, I'm going for like my hardest effort. So it's like even more important. And then on top of that, all the eating patterns are knocked out because I don't really like to eat that early in the morning. So I tend to sort of eat a bit later in the day. So I might not have eaten before. So I just wondered if you noticed in the past that kind of pattern of not just on the nutrition side, but everything, like sort of sleeping. And if you know that you've got a race coming up and you know how you're going to approach that race in terms of eating the night before, sleeping the night before, and what time that race happens, whether you encourage people to try and do almost mock-ups of that race day leading up to it, so your body is ready and like, okay, we're familiar with this.
Yeah, I remember we spoke about it the other day, didn't we, on a phone call, about how this is a bit of an issue with regards to just sport in general. And the biggest sort of way I can liken it to is like boxing or football, players train, but you can never replicate in sparring or in training sessions. You can never replicate stepping out at Anfield or stepping out at York Hall or the O2 Arena in front of crowd. And people train, you know, at midday, but they don't train at 10 p.m. at night when their actual event is. And it's the same with runners, that their event may be really early in the morning, but they do their training runs maybe after work. Yeah, I would try and make sure that you're at least some training runs, try and replicate when your actual event is going to be. And I think just gives your body the best way to adapt, because you don't want to be doing 11 p.m. runs all the time. And then all of a sudden you've got to do an event at 6 a.m. and your body has no idea how to cope with it. And it doesn't have to be anything crazy. You could do like a run and then get home, and on a piece of paper or in a book, you could keep your running book, just write down how you felt during that run. If you felt hungry, if you felt maybe you had some GI issues, if you felt too dehydrated, if you felt heavy on the last 25 minutes. All of these things are useful information for someone like myself to then look at and say, okay, like, how can we prevent that from happening?
No, that's good advice. And we've spoken a bit about in regards to eating before a race, before a training run, that kind of thing. In terms of eating after, that's like everything else, something else that people probably struggle a little bit with. Is there a sort of an optimum time if your average runner gets back in from their, let's say they've gone out for an 8-mile run, 10-mile run, and they get in? I remember in the gym, a lot of guys who were working on aesthetics and stuff talked about straight after a session, just trying to get some protein in as quick as possible. Is that reminiscent of running? Is there such a thing as, like, after the run, try and eat quite quickly afterwards? Is there any benefit in that?
Yes and no is the answer to that. I mean, the best thing to do, obviously, when you finish a run is your body's already going into recovery mode. And you want to give it the best opportunity to provide it with carbohydrates to refuel, fluids to replenish. And I think fluid is probably the main one, which people sort of skip out. Because if you're running a 10-mile run, you could lose, and especially in heat, you could lose up to 1.5 litres, 2 litres of fluid. So the key one in that is fluid, and we call it sort of like the 3 hours of recovery. So you got sort of repair, so that's obviously like protein, refuel with carbohydrates, and rehydrate with fluid. And actually, you get all these recovery drinks, or you get SIS Rego, or you get the latest products chucked at you. One of the best recovery drinks is actually just milk. It's got lots of electrolytes in, B12, calcium to obviously help with bone health, and protein and carbohydrates, a good ratio. So stuff like chocolate milk, as soon as you get in, or a milk-based smoothie, is a really good option to kickstart that recovery. And I say, like, the longer you leave getting any food or nutrition in, because you've also gone a long period without eating as well. So you've gone 2 hours before the run without eating, and then you've had a 2-hour run perhaps. That's 4 hours of the day where you've not got any nutrition in, and your body's just been put through a lot of sort of exercise-induced stress. So I'd aim to get some form of nutrition on board as soon as you get back. And smoothies and things like milk-based drinks are a really good option. And also another thing which I find happens quite a lot is that appetite is often suppressed after exercise. Some people will go the complete other way of the spectrum, and that's a fueling issue, which we can get into. But most people's appetite is suppressed when they finish exercise. You won't get many people that will finish a run and be absolutely starving and will just eat anything under the sun. They usually get back, have a shower, stretch, and be like, oh, I still feel a bit, heart's going and stuff like that from the run. And yeah, and I'd always sort of opt for a food first approach. So it doesn't have to be like a protein shake. You can get it from food. So like, yeah, smoothies, milk-based drinks, and then maybe an hour after that, then look to consume sort of a carbohydrate and protein-rich meal.
One of the things I wanted to talk to you about, Jack, was this idea of fasted running. I think it's something that's, or fasted exercise in general, of course, in our case, fasted runs. It's something that I think is creeping a little more into the general psyche. People aren't quite so confused by someone going out in the morning before eating anything at all. Could you sort of break down very roughly what fasted exercise is? And I know you talked to me before about the idea of also being low carbohydrate as well as leaving a long time span from having eaten it, and kind of what the benefits are regarding fat oxidation and stuff for what a fasted run looks like.
Yeah, so there's kind of two reasons why people do a fasted run. The number one is probably not because they're doing it for a specific sort of training or scientific purpose. They're just doing it because that's the only time they have to run in the morning, and for them to eat a massive bowl of muesli first thing in the morning would mean they'd have to wake up at sort of 4:30, 5 before they run at 7. So people will just do it because it's just like the only time that they can train. So that's one method. The other one is obviously people think that fasted training burns more fat, which is not strictly true. It doesn't burn more fat, but it can have an important role in enhancing fat oxidation. And this is a thing a lot of people get wrong, and cyclists as well. And it's actually doing sort of zone 2, I like to call it, or low intensity runs. So you would want to do a recovery run or something that's low intensity, maybe long in duration, which is going to upregulate obviously the use of fat stores and oxidized fat as a fuel source. And you want to do this by doing what we call being in a carbohydrate restricted state. So you can get into the state by consuming a low carbohydrate diet, which I wouldn't recommend anyway. So that sort of crosses one off the list, like a hard turbo session later in the evening, sort of 6, 7 p.m. And then your dinner afterwards, maybe lower in carbohydrates, but high in protein. Then you'd go to sleep. Obviously, your body's not refueled its carbohydrate stores. And then you would do your fat oxidation or low intensity run first thing in the morning. And what this does is it enhances the breakdown of fat as a fuel source and enhances these training adaptations in the muscle. So it enhances things called the production of mitochondria. So mitochondria are basically the powerhouse or the batteries in your cells. And what it does is it helps produce more of these batteries so that when you're running, you're sort of more of an efficient car, you're more of an efficient engine. But I'd recommend getting one of these sessions in a week. And people will think like, oh, why should I do it? Because essentially what it will do is when you're doing your actual marathon race, you're more of an efficient runner to utilize and dip between different fuel sources. And the longer you can tap into using fat stores as a fuel source means that you save carbohydrates for longer in the race. So you're potentially moving the goalposts and delaying fatigue for as long as you possibly can. That combined with an effective carbohydrate load and good carbohydrate, well planned out nutrition strategy during the race, all it's doing is this sort of line. If you draw a straight line, all you're doing is reducing the time it takes for that to drop down. Whereas somebody else that hasn't implemented their strategies, their drop-off point will be 20 minutes earlier, perhaps. What you'll find is that people that don't have a nutrition plan fatigue much quicker than somebody who does have one.
It's fascinating, really. It's almost like being shown a sort of an extra bonus level you can reach by nailing this nutrition well, because I think you go on that start line and I bet you 30 runners around you, 25 of them are probably just doing very basic stuff. And if you've really trained your body well with nutrition, I think it would be quite amazing. Just even like you say, especially in those longer distance marathon, even when you're talking about small percentages, when you actually do the math on how much time that equals in, whether it be 10, 11, 12 more minutes, when it comes to a marathon PB, that's a lot. That's a lot of time. And it's amazing what a difference this kind of stuff can make. I think one of the final things I wanted to ask you about, Jack, was this idea of caffeine. People have gels and they pick up the gels in, the running shop, or they look online and they go, oh, this one's got caffeine, this one's not got caffeine. Well, should I get the one with caffeine? That might make me more focused. And do you know what I mean? It's that thing of like, do you knock back a coffee before a race? What for you in terms of, and again, it's just something I'm sure you'll probably say isn't quite so important with that kind of 5K, 10K, but once we start to move to that longer distance, half, marathon, ultra, caffeine starts to play a role. What does sort of good caffeine intake look like for you, for someone who's running well and using it correctly?
So first things first, to people that don't really know, that caffeine is one of the best or well-researched ergogenic aids, which basically means a supplement or an aid which is going to enhance your performance. And what it does is it increases cognitive function, reduces perception of effort. So if you get that heavy feeling in your legs, it can sort of help alleviate that, and pain tolerance a bit as well.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And give you that mental boost, which you all know that caffeine can deliver. The issue kind of is that a lot of people opt for coffees. So you don't actually know how much caffeine is in a coffee. And if you actually look on things like, because I'm a bit of a nerd and actually looked at it, I looked at the caffeine content of Costa, Starbucks and Cafe Nero. And in the same drink, I think Costa was 75 milligrams of caffeine in a small Americano, and Cafe Nero is 280 milligrams, which is a huge difference, depending, on your body weight, can have a huge effect. And I think with caffeine, the main thing is that it's highly individual. And a lot of studies coming out now are saying that it's actually genetically predisposed. So you can't just say, oh, have caffeine relative to your body weight, or have this amount of caffeine because you're a male or a female, or you're this athlete. It's actually due to genetics and how you deal with caffeine on that sort of level. So I'd always say that, try and find your own sweet spot with caffeine and what works for you and what sources work for you. I always find that people always say like, oh, I'll have caffeine before my triathlon, or I'll have caffeine before my marathon. And I think, have you done that before? And they go, no. And I say, so should you try it before your event where you're already nervous and anxious, and you might have had a different breakfast because you've planned poorly, or you might not have listened to my advice or something. They go, no, I'll try caffeine. I'll try this coffee at the hotel that was really nice. And I'm thinking, like we just said, that could have 80 milligrams of caffeine. It could have 300 milligrams of caffeine in it. You don't know. So I always try and tell them to opt for the sources which they know how much is in it, like gum, tablets, or actually caffeine in a gel, like you just said. But when I find caffeine is really useful, and this is a really good tip, which I think the listeners can take away, is that I'd only really ever use caffeine sort of I'm talking in an event now, or a long training run, towards the second half. So maybe if it's a marathon, maybe the 2 hour plus mark, you might swap from isotonic gels to caffeine gels.
Okay.
And that's going to give you a massive pick you up around 2 hours, 45 minutes, which is probably when you're starting to really feel it anyway. And it's going to sort of reduce that perception of pain, give you that boost. Try and find the caffeine dosage or that sweet spot which works for you, and write it down. Mile 4 had X amount of caffeine in this source. It worked really well. I felt the effects of it. Get it locked in and then run with it for your event.
I think that's really good advice. I mean, there are people who will, have that kind of automatic upload to Strava now, and that's all fine. You can fill in a few details, but one of the few things I do with running where I'm a bit old school is I do actually write in a book at the moment, and I write down my training runs and stuff. And I think that'll be really fascinating when I do my longer runs to make a note of what I did nutritionally and how that felt. That's really good advice from you, is that idea of locking it in and just starting to evidence base, like what works for you, what's felt good, and how that, like I say, it feels almost like a bit of a cheat code when you kind of think, I know to this point take caffeine, and that's it's quite an exciting way of looking at it, I think. Jack, you work with England Dodgeball. That's amazing. Yeah. How did that happen? How does that work? What's that experience like? What a crazy sport.
Yeah, people always sort of raise their eyebrows up when they hear about this. That came about, kindly enough, we're quite a tight-knit community, like us registered sports nutritionists. We got each other's back. So I actually got given that opportunity from another practitioner that had moved on to another role, and just said, do you fancy doing this? And I was like, yeah, of course. And started working with them since January, February time. And I just work with the players, the development players, and the senior men's squads. And there's around 80 of them, group of staff as well. Obviously, we've been a bit disrupted at the moment because of what's going on with COVID. Obviously, supposed to have Euros. That's not happening. They're European champions still, so they'll be looking to retain that next September. It's really cool, and a sport which people don't really think too much about, but they're really top athletes, and the speeds which they throw the ball at is very hard. And it's a really interesting, cool sport. And I couldn't really believe when I've been to watch them play, actually how physically demanding it is, because you just think of it as just mucking around in PE, playing with a dodgeball, or the film with Ben Stiller. You don't really think too much about how they could be elite athletes, but make no mistake about it, they are. But it's an interesting one for sure, and one people think isn't a thing, but it is a thing, and they get 10 to 15,000 people watching their championships on ESPN. So it's quite big, and it's a big deal to them. So it's a national sport team. So everything we do is, obviously, we're proud to do it. And good bunch of people, good sport to be involved in.
Yeah, I can imagine. Fascinating. What a great one for the CV. So, Jack, I think the final thing, moving up sort of 5K, 10K, half a marathon, talking about taking nutrition on board, one of those really extreme events in running is the ultra, anything over a marathon and going into ultra marathons. Have you had much experience with, maybe even not just in running, but just with that real kind of long, sort of day-long event?
Yeah, so I've worked with 2 ultra marathon runners, and I worked with a group of cyclists last autumn where they cycled over 110, 120 miles a day for 14 days straight from here to Barcelona. That was very challenging. The key ones with that are just to make sure, like I said, that every meal, every snack is based on carbohydrates. And if it's just like a marathon and you just want to focus on getting carbohydrates on board, ultra is a little bit different because you're going for a long period of time, 8 hours plus, where you're not consuming any protein, which is in a normal day we wouldn't do. So it's almost sort of making sure that we're interchanging between carbohydrates and protein and making sure that the muscle's recovering as we're sort of using it. And another one with ultras is, I'd raise the challenge to you. How long do you think you could go before you would stop eating 10 jelly babies an hour? It gets pretty mundane and pretty horrible. But ultra is a completely different challenge, and that's almost like a completely different podcast. But it's just making sure that you're getting as much fuel as you can on board as possible, whilst making it enjoyable for the athlete. So we'd have things like beef jerky and low volume foods which they like, and just try and keep it varied because it's a long time. And I always sort of think, like, if I can try and pack something, or if I can try and throw something in which I know the athlete really likes and is not expecting. So say like, oh yeah, like you can have like some Percy Pigs, or you can have this drink or something, and they're like, oh, I didn't know I could have that. And then that's a massive pick me up, mid ultra or something. But as always, it's making sure you have a plan in place. I knew someone that did an ultra, and she won't mind me saying this, she didn't have a plan at all. She was drinking like fizzy Lucozade, which obviously gives
Oh.
higher concentration. So with hypertonic Lucozade, so Lucozade Original, it's obviously got a higher sugar content or glucose content, which matches what's in your stomach. So if you drink obviously that and it's fizzy during exercise, it can give you GI issues. So she had serious like stomach upsets. There's a lot of people doing ultras, and I can't believe that they do it without a nutrition strategy, or they just wait and see what's served up at the aid stations. It's pretty unbelievable.
Yeah. They are becoming more and more popular. People are venturing more into that kind of longer distance stuff and getting stuck into them. But you're right. I think even then, they don't bring with them a new strategy regarding eating. It's just same old pasta, take a Mars bar in my pocket and kind of, hope it works out kind of thing. I mean, it's been fascinating even for me just to start to learn a few more things, even in the last sort of 6 months to a year. A big thing that I started to change was working with electrolytes a little bit, because I was one of these people who just sort of drink a lot of water. We actually talked about that state. You referenced that thing where if someone drinks too much water, there is actually a thing you can flood the brain and it can actually kill you.
Yeah, hyponatremia, and there was a case of it at the Boston Marathon where quite a lot of people died from it. It's basically with the thought that I need to drink, I need to hydrate, but the kidney can only deal with so much fluid or liters of fluid per hour. Think of almost the sodium or the electrolytes as the transporter, which transports the water into the cell. Without that sodium, which is being lost by sweat and perspiration, without that sodium or those electrolytes, the water is just going flooding in the system. It can't get into the cells. Like insulin with glucose, it transports it into the cell. You can very easily make your own sports drink with just some orange or pineapple juice, 300-400 milliliters, add some water to dilute it down, fructose and glucose in there from the juice, and then you can add a pinch of salt, and then you've got your own electrolyte drink, which costs, I don't know, 25p max. Yeah, less than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I imagine there's quite a lot of money you can save if you start to know how to, going right back to that sort of chefing stage of creating the food yourself and making your own. I imagine there's a lot of things like that where you could save a bit on the cost and make your own stuff. That's quite an interesting concept. Jack, thank you so much for coming on. That's been absolutely fascinating. I'm sure we'll do another episode in the future and we'll touch on some other subjects because there's so much. If people want to know a bit more or even look at doing some one-on-one stuff with you, what's the best way to get in contact? What would be the first steps to get in contact with you?
I'm most active on Instagram, as most people are. I post regularly on there, and quite a lot of my clients come from there. So that's Jack Coak _nutrition on Instagram. My website's coming out in September, so people can take a look at that when that comes out, or just you can email me at info@jackcoak.co.uk.
Well, Jack, thank you so much for coming on. It's been really fascinating. It's a really important topic that I think a lot of people don't have quite as much knowledge about, and it's quite fascinating to actually hear someone in the know with some of these, and I'm sure there'll be some great takeaways from this conversation for people. So just thank you very much for coming on.
No worries. Thanks for having me on, Harry. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much for watching or listening to this episode of Jog On. If you want to help us out, recommend an episode to a friend. You can follow us on Instagram at Jog On Podcast. And if you want to get in contact, it's thisisjogon@gmail.com. I'm Harry. Eat well, go for that run. And this is Jog On.